Carson Wentz to the Washington Commanders. I understand why, but I really fucking hate it. Washington believes that it is on the right track, and it desperately needed a quarterback. To the Commanders' credit, they reportedly reached out to every team in the league about their quarterback's availability to try to find the right guy. Unfortunately, that guy ended up being Carson Wentz. In no way is it a flashy trade, but Washington's recent quarterback mess makes it look a lot better. Without a doubt, Wentz is the best quarterback to make his way to Washington since Kirk Cousins. Although I think it's pretty obvious that Carson Wentz was obviously not the splash that Washington was looking for. Aaron Rodgers decided to stay in Green Bay, and most importantly, Russell Wilson landed in Denver after Washington wanted to try to make a big offer for him. Wentz was the last option, and the trade at least made some sense. The Commanders got Wentz in exchange for 2 third-rounders, one of which could turn into a second based on incentives, and a swap of second-rounders. I think it goes without saying that despite Wentz not being a sexy pickup, he's still a rather big upgrade over Taylor Heinicke. As fun as he is to watch, Washington wants to win games, and it'll have a better chance with Wentz behind center. Wentz's contract is likely one of the most important pieces of the equation. He's getting paid about $28 million this season, and that is, of course, a wild overpay, but it is necessary for Washington. The number that is really important, though, is how it could affect the cap in 2023. If the Commanders keep Wentz around, it'll be around a $26 million hit. But if they want to get rid of him, well, they can save all $26 million without a single penny in dead cap. Meaning, if Washington wants to move on from Wentz after one season, it'll be very easy. Wentz has had quite the career so far. From the prized expected savior in Philadelphia after going number 2 in the 2016 NFL draft to a near MVP season that came crumbling down with a torn ACL, but ultimately ended in the Eagles' first franchise Super Bowl and a slow end to his time in the city of brotherly love. After years of injuries and inconsistent play, the Eagles shipped him off to the Colts, where Wentz put up a good statistical season, but he just crumbled under the pressure when it mattered the most, and his 2 worst games of the season were to close out the regular season, causing Indianapolis to miss the playoffs. Washington has had a busier offseason than probably expected, including a lot of somewhat surprising cuts. Safety Landon Collins made a ton of sense to cut. He'll save almost $12 million if he's a post-June 1st cut, and simply put, he just wasn't very good last season. The Commanders also saved $2 million by cutting safety DeShazer Everett. Clearly a new need for safety, but they weren't even done there. Washington cut guard Eric Flowers to save $10 million and cut defensive tackle Matt Ioannidis to save $7 million. Overall, the 4 cuts save Washington around $31 million against the cap this season. Plus, they already lost guard Brandon Sheriff and defensive tackle Tim Settle in the offseason, and had reportedly lost running back J.D. McKissic before he had a last-minute change of heart to stay in Washington. There's a lot to unpack with the Carson Wentz situation, and I think one of the biggest things is looking at him through the view of the NFC East, and that is that I think undeniably he is the second best quarterback in the NFC East. It's not Jalen Hurts and it's not Daniel Jones, and that only really leaves Carson Wentz. I think Dak Prescott is head and shoulders the number 1 guy, but the way Wentz does fit into the NFC East, he's better than 2 of the 3 current quarterbacks. I do think that overall, this makes Washington a better team on paper, on the field, and everything. And I personally loved Taylor Heinicke. He was so much fun to watch. He seems like a great guy, and he's going to still be on the team as the backup quarterback for next season. But having Carson Wentz is a clear and obvious upgrade. Of course, it does sting a little bit. I'm sure we're going to see some of Taylor Heinicke next season. Carson Wentz is known for being injury prone. I couldn't tell you the last time he had a full season where he played every game. It might have been his rookie year, honestly. And so I think without a doubt, we're still going to see Taylor Heinicke, but for the time being, Carson Wentz is that guy. I think what stings the most is that it was very obvious that Washington wanted to make a huge play on a quarterback, and I think the unfortunate reality is that from the very beginning, it was obvious that Washington was going to have to get a guy like a Carson Wentz or a Jameis Winston or a Marcus Mariota who would be willing to go to Washington for, X amount of money, because none of the top guys wanted to go there. There was a lot of rumblings with Russell Wilson, and I guess at times it made sense. He's from Richmond, just like me and Darren are, and so Richmond's pretty close to Washington, and I get that would have been home, but he didn't want to go to Washington. Why would you want to go play for the Commanders when you can force your your way out to a different team like the Broncos. And of course, Aaron Rodgers decided to stay in Green Bay. I don't think he ever would have considered going to Washington anyway. He is trying to ring chase. Why would he go to Washington? But I think it was obvious in the moment, Washington wasn't going to get a top guy. Anybody that thought Washington was going to get a top guy was crazy. It was never going to happen. Not that I love that we had to stick with Carson Wentz, but I don't actually mind the trade when you really look at it. I don't mind what we gave up necessarily. It might end up being a second and a third. It might just end up being 2/3. I don't think that's a huge deal. The second might sting a very, very little bit, but it's not a huge deal in the grand scheme of things. If you can get a guy that you want to take a shot on, and you're definitely going to be better next year because you went after him. I think Washington knows that this might not be a long-term solution, and that's very obvious. Carson Wentz isn't an elite quarterback, and if you want to win in the NFL right now, you have to have an elite quarterback or a very, very cheap quarterback, and Carson Wentz is neither of those. Washington knows that they're going to be much better next year, likely because of Carson Wentz, but it's not a long-term solution. They need to look towards the draft or trying to find a different guy in free agency next year or doing whatever they can to get a top-tier quarterback, and that's why the Carson Wentz trade makes sense. Is because you found a good bridge guy that you unfortunately have to pay a lot of money to, but it gives you room to be okay next year, contend for the division, and then figure things out from there with a guy whose contract you can completely get rid of and off the books before next season if you want to. I do wonder if Washington still has any interest in looking towards the draft this season. I think it's a very, very weak NFL draft, and if they're trying to go after a quarterback, it might be better off just going for a late round guy and try to hit a diamond in the rough like you did with Kirk Cousins, or just forget about it altogether and look towards next season. I think those top guys, Kenny Pickett and Malik Willis, I think either one of them could actually be there at number 11, but I don't love either one. In fact, I read a Kenny Pickett thing the other day, and his pro comparison was Taylor Heineke. That's horrifying. I don't want Kenny Pickett anywhere near Washington if that's his pro comparison. But I don't have a ton of faith in Kenny Pickett, and I think Malik Willis could be a star in the NFL, but he needs the right situation. In Washington, in my entire lifespan, has had no idea how to develop a quarterback. So I think just waiting till next season, if you want to go after a rookie quarterback, is going to be the best move for Washington, and I think they know that. There's going to be much better quarterbacks next year. See if you can somehow luck into a Bryce Young or CJ Stroud. I do have a lot of questions on Washington this offseason. I'm not 100% sure what they're trying to do. They've now cleared up a lot of cap room, and some of the cuts made sense. Like I mentioned, Landon Collins and Deshavier Everett were becoming more of a headache than anything. It made sense to just get rid of them, clean slate at safety, figure it out from there. Eric Flowers is an odd one. They brought in Andrew Norwell, who's now going to be, I'm sure, just going to take over that spot that Flowers was in. I get that $10 million is a lot of money, but he had been playing very well. Matt Ioannidis, as much as it kind of stings, I feel like you could have gotten something back for either Flowers or Ioannidis. Ioannidis does sting a little bit. He's been fantastic for the last 2 years, hasn't had the same productions, has dealt with some injuries, and overall, he's pretty much a backup defensive lineman, and you don't want to pay that guy $7 million. The J.D. McKissic situation was very, very odd with Washington. It was announced that he went to the Bills, 2 years, $7 million, and then it said he had a change of heart and decided to stick in Washington instead of going to Buffalo, but apparently Washington never offered him. They didn't offer him until Buffalo had already offered him, and he already had agreed to that contract, and so then Washington was like, oh, we'd pay you the same amount, and McKissic was like, okay, then I want to stay. Why didn't you just, I don't understand, Washington, they find weird ways to screw things up, and I just don't understand why the hell you didn't just offer J.D. McKissic in the first place, and that whole mess would have never even happened. Regardless, I really don't know how to feel about Washington going into next season. I don't have a ton of confidence in Carson Wentz. I don't have a lot of confidence in this roster as a whole, but I think you got to figure some things out. And why did they get rid of that cap room? It's probably to sign Terry McLaurin, and that is step one to getting things figured out. Re-sign Terry McLaurin, make sure Chase Young stays in that building. You already have John Allen for a long period of time, but the biggest thing, and it's not Carson Wentz, is trying to figure out that quarterback situation. Carson Wentz is a good bridge quarterback for 2022, but just know that next offseason, I'm going to be sitting here making another video wondering what the hell Washington is doing behind center.